Good day, folks. Really code-heavy lesson ahead. We're going to be working with the code that's going to call on the animator controller that we worked with in the last lesson. And then we're also going to be hooking Ruby up with a pre-made animation controller and adjusting the code within the Ruby script. Cool stuff. All right, so last time we did a lot of cool stuff with setting up some ways to basically call upon a certain animation when certain inputs are given. Well, we need to have it so that it's hooked into the enemy controller script. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll go to scripts, and we're going to be opening up the enemy controller. Okay. So in this case here, we've got, let's put it like right about here. We're going to be needing to create an animator variable. So this is going to be what's going to be called upon to kind of work with the component we added and coded last time. So after, it doesn't really matter as long as it's within the class file. But where you have your other variables declared, we're just going to say here, say animator. An animator. So this is basically a variable of the type animator, and we're going to call it animator. So we'll start off with that, okay? And now we're going to adjust the start function, okay? So we're going to be setting it up so that our start function will initialize at just our, we're going to say get component, and basically just start off just as we did with our get component rigid body 2D. So we declare the variable up here, and then we basically give it a state. We associate whatever the animator component is and associate it with that animator variable. Let me go full screen here. Sorry, folks. And make it a little bit bigger too. Always nice. So now what we're going to be doing is, and if we think back to sort of these parameters here. So, we'd played with them manually as far as like adjusting them like this, and then based upon whatever value is given to move X or move Y, a certain animation will be called upon, like a certain sort of visual will be called upon. Okay, so we just set up our animator variable here. We're going to go ahead and scroll down to fix update. Okay. Now in fix update, we're going to go ahead and basically say, like, if it detects that we're moving vertically, okay, we're going to do the following. And I'm just going to sort of add this here. Now let's talk about this. Animator.setFloat moveX 0. Animator.setFloat move Y direction. So in this case here, we going back to this, where we have these parameters here, move X and move Y. We set it up last time that they would, return a certain animation based upon the parameters or like information that's being passed to it. So in this case here, if we detect that the enemy is moving up, if it's a vertical mover, we're going to always want to set the X position or the sort of the X input to 0, because if the enemy is only moving up and down, he's not moving side to side. That X value is never going to change. So we don't want any sort of blending with any of that side to side movement. We want it only up and down. So in this case here, when we say here pass set float, so we call upon the animator component, we set the float to of move Y to whatever the direction the enemy is going in. So that could be a positive or a negative number. If it's positive, it's going to show that enemy sort of moving up, and if it's negative, it's going to show it moving down. We're going to do the same thing here with the X direction. So we just did the moving along the Y-axis. Let's go ahead and do the X-axis. Whoops. So again, same thing. If we have it set so that the enemy is only going to be moving side to side, we want to make sure that the parameter that the animator is receiving for the Y direction is going to be set to 0. And we can sort of check this out now. Let's save this. I just did Command S to save it. You can sort of just do file save as well, but it's going to refresh here a second, and let's make sure it works. Come on now. Okay, cool. You can ignore this warning. Okay, so let's go ahead here to there. There he is. There's our good old robo. And you can see as he moves up and down, works like that. I know this works, but I could also then just take off vertical and then he would go side to side and the animation's going to work. Cool. Okay, so what's next? We are now going to be working with Ruby. So let's go ahead and go to our animations folder here. And there is a animation controller just called Ruby. The project gave us this file, so we don't really have to gave us this component. We don't have to create it on our own. So there's Ruby. I'm going to drag and drop that on the Ruby that's in my project hierarchy. Let's see if I actually added it. Nope, I didn't. So let's go ahead and just add that to her. And now Ruby's got an animator. Let's also add it to the prefab. So let's go ahead where it says overrides and then just say apply all. Okay. And now let's go to the Ruby that is in our prefabs folder. Cool. Okay, so in this case here, let's go to our animator just to see all of the states that we have with the Ruby character. So we've got here some different states. We've got idle, moving, hit, and launch. And you'll see here with hit and launch, those look different. Let's first of all talk about X and Y, look X and look Y. Those are basically the same as what we did with our robot, where they have certain states like which way is Ruby looking as far as up and side to side. Now, hit and launch are going to be used with the triggers, which will be one-time events, not based upon movement. Hit will be anytime Ruby gets damaged, and launch will be related to projectiles, but we'll be playing with those later. Another thing, too, if you look at between these different animation states, you've got, see these arrows here. Now, these arrows are going to indicate as far as what type of animations will be called, as well as what are the transitions between the animations going to look like. So in this case, can we see this as far as a preview? Okay, cool. No model available. Perfect. So that'll be one of those things where you can sort of see the transition between the idle state and the moving state. And in the case of some of these things, with more different animations where it says has exit time. If that's enabled, you're going to basically have it set so that if you would want to have an animation play completely before it transitions to a different state or something like that. So anyways, let's go ahead and check out the one thing too as far as hit. You can see that it's going to be something that's going to happen immediately, and you see there's that condition as far as getting hit. It's going to be a condition rather than, if we look here at moving, you can see speed is going to go like that. It's going to be the parameter rather than a trigger. Okay, you see that's a number rather than a condition. Okay. Anyways, let's go ahead and this is going to be some pretty serious scripting. Let's go ahead to our Ruby controller. Okay. Is that big enough? Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to be creating two new variables. So we can go ahead and create our animation controller as well as we're going to be using a vector controller as well. So let's go ahead. I'm going to put it below my vertical and horizontal floats. Okay. What I did here is the same thing with the robot. I created an animator variable. Okay. I created a variable called animator of the animator type. And we've worked with vectors before, I believe, but vectors are going to contain sort of two different coordinates as far as an x and a y. We're going to also initialize those vectors to 1 and 0. We'll sort of talk about that in a bit. Okay, with our start, we're also going to, just as we did with our robot, we're going to create we're going to associate the animator variable with the current sort of state of the animator that's going to be associated with Ruby. Okay. So let's go ahead here, and we're going to go to our make some adjustments with our update function. Okay, and I'll have this, I think, maybe I'll put this in Schoology. Okay, so we are getting rid of, for me, it's going to be lines 37 and 38. It might be slightly different for you, but it's going to be the first two things we had in the update function. All right, and so let's go ahead, change this up, and we're going to just get rid of lines 37 and 38, and we're going to change this. And let's clean this code up. Folks, I made an error when I recorded this initially, and I'll have this corrected in Schoology. But there should not be the word float before the horizontal and vertical variables. That should be deleted. Okay. And I'll have this in Schoology then, folks. Okay. Okay, so what we have here, sort of basically the same situation, float horizontal, float vertical. But we have here, we define a move variable, which is going to be of the vector2 type, based upon the horizontal and vertical sort of inputs. Okay, so the reason why we use vector2 is it's going to contain both the sort of x and y information that's being passed to Ruby. So vector2 is nice because it kind of contains but also separates those two, like the x, sort of the direction of the x and the direction of the y. It's kind of nice like that. We could keep those two variables separate, vertical and horizontal, but it's going to simplify our code. So anyways, just know that the move has two sort of like properties or contains two very distinct bits of information. What's the current horizontal movement? What's the current vertical information? Okay? So anytime you see move, just know that it contains two very important bits of information. We then say in the update function, and this is a very seemingly complex piece of code that accomplishes a pretty simple task. So an if statement is basically checking to see if something is true or false. And there's some complex sort of symbols we have to explore in this in line 42. For me, yours might be slightly off. This exclamation point here is a not symbol. Okay, so it's paradoxically, or sort of like sort of strangely enough, sometimes you're going to want to check to see if something is not true. Okay, so we could say that, like, classic example, like exploring sort of like, these are called Boolean statements, is going to be something like, if it's not raining, I do not need to bring an umbrella. All right. So that's what that exclamation point means. Before we get into like what this means, let's also discuss these two pipes here. Those two pipes are that's called an OR. Okay, so an OR statement is what would be represented by those two pipes. So in this case, what it's saying here is, if this condition or this condition is not true, then do the following. All right. So let's get into what these conditions are exactly. Math.f. We've worked with math, the mathf functions before. We worked with as far as the clamps. I think, yeah, we have a clamp somewhere. Yes, with math.f clamp, it's anytime you want to do something like built in as far as like working with numbers. In this case here, we're saying math.f approximately. So in the world of computers, sometimes the ability for a computer to be very, very, very specific is actually a downside. We are working with what are called floating point numbers. So we are like, the computers can sometimes be so precise that if this, that there's it can track if something is 0.000001, like it can keep track of that as far as like if we're examining movement, it can keep track of that. So what this does is if math.f approximately, and it checks to see, is move along the x-axis, if movement along the x-axis is almost 0. So basically with approximately, it's saying like if you're really close to 0, if you're really close to 0 for the y movement, then you're going to go ahead and set the look direction to a certain value. And then normalize is going to basically be additional processing for that floating point number. All right. So it's essentially like a way to set it so that this whole function here, checking to see as far as like, is it not close to 0, is basically so that if you are not currently moving in a direction, then don't call this. Then don't set the look direction, okay, and just set it so that it's sort of set to that idle state. All right. Okay. This is again too as far as like we are passing the set float to the lookx of lookx to our look direction dot x, which we had defined as far as our the different animation states, and then the speed is going to be set to the magnitude of how how quickly the Ruby character is moving. Pretty tough stuff. If you want a text explanation of that, I recommend checking out the text instructions for this. I did a verbal one. You're certainly welcome to try and get a different take on it. Okay, we have one last thing to do. So where it comes to the change health, we're going to set a trigger to hit if the change health amount is less than 0. All right, so animator.setTrigger, set that trigger to hit. Okay, so let's save this and test it.